समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
It was unclear that America would join the fray. President Trump decided to do so because he saw the success that Israel was having and he wanted to be associated with that success. That on one hand, Israel is being alienated diplomatically in the international arena, but at the same time, Israel is now becoming the rising tiger of the Middle East. I mean, its stock market yesterday just went up exponentially in the aftermath of the attacks. But from a purely strategic perspective, they were not addressing what's the looming security threat, what are security and strategic dynamics of the region. And that is a lot less sexy.
From India's perspective, we have stakes in the normalization of the Middle Eastern region. As you may be aware, that we have ambitious connectivity programs such as the IMEC, which actually hinge on the normalization of the Middle Eastern region, which is coming from the Abraham Accords. And one of the reasons why we have not been able to...
I want to stop you there. If you look at countries like Britain, France, Spain, countries that are very, very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, they are geopolitically irrelevant.
So, welcome to the WorldView with Swasti. And in a recent development, Israel has attacked Hamas leaders in Qatar. And that has escalated the situation in the Middle East in a really new way. Now, that's made Donald Trump very unhappy about the strike. He has said that this doesn't advance either Israeli interest or the American interest. And Qatar, of course, shocked, has said that it has the right to retaliate. But there are more questions than answers. Where does it take the normalization process which was underway in the Middle East? What about Qatar's mediation efforts? What about Israel's and Bibi Netanyahu's attempts at eradicating Hamas leadership? Because according to the reports, what we know is that the top leadership is still there, and only the second rank of the leaders, about 5 of them, have been killed in the latest strikes. What happens to the different air bases that Qatar has, apart from the Americans? And what about the American security guarantees to Qatar? And to unpack these questions with me, today I'm joined by Dr. Barak Seener, who is a Senior Associate Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and founder of Strategic Intelligentia and the Gulf Futures Forum. Barak also co-hosts the Geo Godfather Wars podcast on Geopolitical Affairs. He has earlier been a Middle East Fellow at Royal United Services Institute on RUSI, and he joins me live from London. Barak, what a pleasure to be joined by you, and we need to understand from your expertise on the region what is going on in the Middle East.
Thank you for having me, Swasti.
Yeah, thanks, Barak. And you have been writing extensively on the region. You have written extensively on the topic. So let's start with the very basics. What is happening in the Middle East? Why do you think Israel has taken it so far as to really attack, Qatar, Hamas leadership in Qatar? Don't you think this has kind of escalated the situation to another level and put back all the mediation efforts?
I think that we have to understand this from the context of what Israel was contending with. Iran had, to a great degree, created a strategy called the Ring of Fire strategy that was to engulf Israel from all angles. So it had Syria and Hezbollah in the north, it had Hamas in the south in Gaza, it had as well Hamas in the West Bank, it had the Houthis firing on Israel as well from Yemen. So Israel was facing threats from nearly every single angle. And until October the 7th, Israel's whole strategy was to react to threats as they emerge on its immediate borders. And Israel underwent a doctrinal shift to become much more preemptive, to address threats that weren't immediately on its borders and to project power at a broader range across the region. So, as such, it was, it established air dominance over Tehran, and it targeted successfully nuclear scientists and military commanders, the leadership. It took out the Houthi government. It took out senior Hamas officials, whether they be in Tehran, in Gaza, and now in Qatar. So Israel has reached a conclusion that it's not able to maintain a purely defensive posture and react on its borders, but it must project power more broadly across the region. Now, I don't think that it creates an escalation in the region. On the contrary, we have to understand that Israel's military primacy in the region underpins the Abraham Accords. When you look at Gulf states that are recognizing Israel or they want security or trade ties with Israel, it's not done out of benevolence. It's done out of a reflection of a landscape which is an Iranian threat to Gulf states, but also growing Israeli military capacity. So irrespective of public pronouncements by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the successful results that Israel has in striking not only its opponents, but Hamas being part of the Muslim Brotherhood is a threat to GCC states as well. That actually inspires confidence amongst Gulf states. Now, the question needs to be asked, to what extent was the status quo tenable in that Qatar is known to be funding the Muslim Brotherhood and malign activities across the region, and it's been doing so for decades, much to the chagrin of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, right? So when I look at GCC states such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they have exactly the same security and strategic concerns as Israel, regardless of public protestations that they make to their base. And if Qatar is harboring terrorists, how was it that until now Israel didn't really protest about this? This was something that it was just simply a matter of time till these figures would get targeted. And amongst these figures included Hamas members from the West Bank, in which there is enormous tensions that are mounting. Israelis are thinking, okay, we're contending with Gaza at the moment. Now, tomorrow is going to be the West Bank. So eliminating these terrorists is critical for Israel's security.
Yeah, point taken. Point taken. But I need to sort of still ask you. So what we keep reading about what Israel is doing is that on the one hand, of course, you saw this massive retaliation against Iran, and the very fact that the United States joined in with the B-2 bombers and struck the Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo. I mean, that was itself an unprecedented situation in the Middle East in its own right. And after that, we have seen Israel going after Houthis on the one hand. It has gone after Hamas, of course, all the time. On the other hand, then it has also been going after the situation in Gaza, for which it has received a lot of flack also from all over the world. In fact, that has also triggered a lot of European countries to really go forward with recognizing the Palestinian state, etc. So, what I'm saying is that from your perspective, since you study this region so closely, don't you see that Israel's multi-pronged strategy of taking all these adversaries at the same time is bound to also somewhere be counterproductive, because does Israel also have the capabilities to go after all these different state and non-state actors? I mean, how does it plan? How does
So,
it
look, I'm
approach?
going to answer from a purely geopolitical perspective because you've mixed in a couple of things. You've mixed in diplomacy, Israel being diplomatically alienated, and its strategic interests. What we're seeing now is a really ironic dichotomy that's taking place. That on one hand, Israel is being alienated diplomatically in the international arena, but at the same time, Israel is now becoming the rising tiger of the Middle East. I mean, its stock market yesterday just went up exponentially in the aftermath of the attacks. It is developing military primacy. So the European street, or rather European governments, are taking greater umbrage at Israel than Middle Eastern governments are, because Middle Eastern governments, they recognize that Israel is growing from a military, security, and intelligence perspective. Also, from a purely geopolitical place, it's important to recognize the fact that Britain wasn't even given heads up before the strikes on Tehran. It was first Israel that took the initiative to do so. It was unclear that America would join the fray. President Trump decided to do so because he saw the success that Israel was having and he wanted to be associated with that success. And if you look at countries like Britain, France, Spain, countries that are very, very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, they are geopolitically irrelevant. They wield no authority in the region, and it's kind of background noise. But if you look at the signal and not the noise, the signal is that the diplomatic protestations don't really matter. It's about to what extent can Israel project power, anchor the Abraham Accords, and bear in mind that the part of a really important function of the Abraham Accords is not simply to alienate Iran, but it's also to enable America to have a lighter footprint in the region. It's in order that Israel can anchor America's strategic interests and, in a sense, block Russia and China's increased involvement in the region. So when you look at it from a purely geostrategic outlook, Britain is irrelevant, France is irrelevant, and Spain is irrelevant. Another thing as well, when you want to consider the issue of noise and signal, is, the history books will one day address how was it that Poland needed to activate Article 4 of NATO simply because of a Russian drone entering its airspace. How come European nations weren't focusing on their own need to increase their military capabilities when there was a looming Russian threat to their security? And the answer will be because their attention was distracted from their own security and strategic interests, which is the threat of Russia on its borders. And they were behaving like grassroots organizations going on the Palestinian issue. But from a purely strategic perspective, they were not addressing what's the looming security threat, what are security and strategic dynamics of the region. And that is a lot less sexy. It does not appeal to the public grassroots than the real issues at hand.
All right. So now let's just focus a little bit on the role of United States, because United States has Qatar as its important ally in the region. I mean, decades of money has gone into this relationship, and this is also bipartisan. Qatar has also had this bipartisan engagement. In many ways, it's the same for Israel as well. And we saw that Qatar. I mean, of course, this is a conversation which we are having in India as well. So I would like to have your views on it, which is that people are saying that you cannot really take Donald Trump's security assurances any seriously, because the Qataris came up and said that the Americans did not tell them, did not give them any prior information about these attacks, these strikes. That's on the one hand. And this all comes in the background of Qatar actually gifting a luxury 747 jumbo jet, to the United States. I mean, especially to Donald Trump. So, years of having the F series fighters, years of sort of investing in the US and having a large base on their soil from the United States, and the United States does not inform the Qataris about the strike. Now, how do you make sense of it? Because we are also living in a time when America seems to be retreating from its guarantees, whether you see the case of NATO, whether you see now in the Middle East. I mean, how do you make sense of that?
I think that your question is quite strange in that you place the onus on the United States. Your question is, how reliable is the United States in that it can't maintain its commitment? That's essentially your question. But the reason why I think it's strange is because you need to be addressing who these commitments are towards. When you look at a state like Qatar, it functions like a very ambiguous state. On one hand, it has huge American military assets on its soil, but on the other hand, it is sponsoring every jihadi group in the region that is seeking to expel America from the region, and it's targeting US servicemen. It's just that ambiguity of these states pose an enormous security risk. Your point about the fact that America wants a light footprint in the region feeds into the growing role that Israel is going to be taking, because for successive administrations, America has wanted to pivot towards Asia. That's where it sees its great power competition. There's that great line in The Godfather, just when I thought I was out, I was drawn back in, right? That's been America's continual story in the Middle East. And it doesn't want to put up with it. It doesn't want to be there. So in a sense, Israel is doing the dirty work for many in the international community that will be beneficiaries of the security that it generates for it.
Yeah, all right. No, point taken. I mean, of course, Israel, from India's perspective, we have stakes in the normalization of the Middle Eastern region. As you may be aware, that we have ambitious connectivity programs such as the IMEC, which actually hinge on the normalization of the Middle Eastern region, which is coming from the Abraham Accords. And one of the reasons why we have not been able to make
Sorry,
any.
I want to stop you there. The
Yeah.
normalization in the region that comes from the Abraham Accord is not causal of
Okay.
dynamics. It's a symptom. If Israel did not have growing military capabilities, there would be no Abraham Accords. So the IMEC that hinges on the Abraham Accords and normalization is underpinned by Israel's security. If Israel did not undergo a doctrinal shift post October the 7th, if Israel was beleaguered by threats on all its borders and could not contend with it in the preemptive manner that it has done so effectively, there would be no IMEC either.
Yeah. No.
Politics is not moral. Politics is power-based, right? Power underpins security, which underpins normalization and stability.
Right, because from India's perspective, of course, when we look at the Middle Eastern region, we have important stakes with Israel, but at the same time, we have important stakes with the Emiratis, with Saudis, with Qataris, of course, with Iran. And that also, I mean, you sitting in London could argue that India's policy in the Middle East is also problematic because, in balancing all sides, perhaps, India is also finding it difficult to really articulate what really its policy in the Middle East is all
But
about.
by the
And
way,
I
that
would,
what you're expressing about India is
yeah.
reflective of India across the board, not only vis-a-vis the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis America. And you know what? It's correct that India should have that strategic calculus because it's based on its history, it's based on its geography, right? It is a responsible thing for India to have to attempt to have a degree of strategic ambiguity and on one hand seek economic relations with China while having security relations with the United States. And it's also possible that the Trump administration that was bringing India into its gravitational sphere undermined that strategic balance by placing tariffs on India. But India is not the only country that has the luxury of doing that. Saudi Arabia has done the same thing, seeking to have security relations and economic relations with the United States while also being part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, having a rapprochement with Iran. States have to do whatever they can in order to maximize their own security. So while India has the luxury of having that ambiguity vis-a-vis the region, within the region itself, actors don't have the luxury of having that ambiguity. Israel certainly doesn't have the luxury of having that strategic ambiguity. So I'm not talking here about morals. I'm talking here about security and strategic dynamics.
Right. Now, a couple of things also from you, which is that how do you see the spillover, if any? Because Qatar has other bases as well. Qatar doesn't only have the US base, Qatar's at other bases as well. And the topmost leadership is still not eradicated, according to the statement released by Hamas. So, do you see a spillover, if any? Do you see Israel repeating it? Yeah.
I think that there would be limited spillover. Qatar doesn't have an army. It's able to achieve its strategic goals simply by paying for proxies and, in a sense, buying Western governments. If you look here in London, right, you could say that the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund owns the City of London. It just does. So that impacts policies. They don't need a standing army. At best, it will have the spillover from sort of economic domination of Western governments to demanding diplomatic criticism of Israel. But they're not going to jeopardize their security relationships with the United States. Again, this strategic ambiguity that Qatar demonstrates is not just ambiguity for ambiguity's sake. It borders Iran. So on one hand, it must make nice to Iran. On the other hand, it must make nice to Islamist Sunni proxies throughout the region, and it also needs a security guarantee for itself. So it hosts a huge US military base. So, in a sense, Qatar's positioned itself as the Switzerland of the Middle East. But in order to achieve for itself that security, but as it's achieved that security, it has funded and fostered risk and instability. That has been the way that it's achieved security for itself by creating radicalization throughout the region, including Hamas in Gaza.
All right. Now, just a commonsensical question that probably most of the audiences would have in mind, and perhaps you could throw some light on that, Barak, which is that does it also, or will it deter Qatar from housing the Hamas leaders in the future? would it become, more
I
difficult
would.
for them? Has it raised the costs? Yeah.
It's definitely raised the cost. The deterrence will be the degree that the cost will incur. I don't think this is only a question for Qatar. I think this is also a question for Turkey, right? To what extent will Israel go to target its enemies abroad? And I think that Israel won't care which country these terrorist leaders will be located in. They will, in a sense, Israel was founded on the concept of never again, that Jewish blood isn't cheap. And therefore, never again entails that terrorists be targeted wherever they are. Now, when the United States targeted Osama bin Laden, who was hosted right opposite a military base in Pakistan, nobody questioned, oh my gosh, how was President Obama willing to undermine Pakistani sovereignty in order to strike Osama bin Laden? Everybody celebrated the successful assassination of Osama bin Laden. So if we don't want to have double standards, I don't think Israel cares about sovereignty of states like Qatar, because your sovereignty, you undermine your own sovereignty when you are willing to harbor terrorists that threaten another's security.
All right. And where does this leave Qatar's role as a mediator? That's one thing that Qataris have been projecting for not just this particular time, but it goes back. The history goes back to the 90s. They have presented themselves as the mediators, and especially in this particular tension that sort of saw an escalation after the 7th October attack and all the events that followed through 2024, and now we are in 2025. Where does this leave Qatar as a mediator?
Look, there are many in Israel that have found Qatar's genuine role as an interlocutor as unconvincing, being as they fuel and fund radicalism, including Hamas in the first place. There were many in Israel that had been a long time basically protesting against Netanyahu, saying, look, Qatar is actually saying to Hamas not to release the hostages. So if this is indeed true, which I'm not sure it is, but if if Qatar was actually undermining negotiations while serving as a mediator, which is another form of ambiguity, then at best it would position Hamas to be a more responsible mediator in the future.
All right, and just the last question from you, the last question for you, Barak, which is, how do you see the question of the hostages? I mean, Israel has hostages, so does Hamas, and for Hamas, this looks like the only bargaining chip they have.
So I wouldn't make that moral equivalence between having starved hostages underground who are being physically abused and mutilated to Palestinian prisoners, who have conducted acts of violence. They weren't taken when they were in a music festival, right? So I wouldn't create any equivalence between sort of Palestinian prisoners and Israeli hostages. So I would just point that out.
No, that's fine. But then what I'm asking you, of course, I mean, what happened on October 7th was something which was completely heinous. There's no two ways about that. But what I'm asking you is that right now, with the way the situation looks in the region, where do you see this question going? I mean, what is the way that Israel can really get back its citizens that have been there with the Hamas, terrorists for so long now?
Look, Israel's rationale is that, you had Secretary of State Rubio that said that every time European states such as France or Britain spoke about a Palestinian state and emphasized negotiations, it actually gave Hamas the initiative and it undermined the release of the hostages. So Israel's rationale is adopting a more hardline approach and targeting Hamas, including Hamas's leadership in Qatar, will place the hostages in better stead. Regardless of the rationale, I don't think there's anything that can be done 100% to secure the release of the hostages, because ultimately nobody knows how to achieve that. So then Israel needs to be thinking, okay, how can we its strategic priority has to be, how can we prevent Hamas from reconstituting itself and preventing another attack on Israeli soil to prevent another October the 7th, as opposed to taking the diplomatically polite courses of action now, which serves the effect of merely kicking the can down the road for another few years till it erupts again.
Okay. On that note, Dr. Barak Seener, thank you so much for taking the time out and actually helping us unpack the situation, which looks fairly complex, and also giving us some cues into how do you think it is going to unfold. Just for the audiences, you can go to the Henry Jackson Society and visit the homepage of Dr. Barak Seener's, and you will find a whole host of writings that he has done, because he's a prolific researcher. So look forward to having you some other time soon. And you are watching the Worldview with Swasti. Stay tuned.